Hello, everybody. All right, so we're doing Chapter 4, Dearborn Essentials of New Jersey Real Estate, key terms. So you know how this goes. If you've watched some of my videos before, with the key terms, we're going to say the key term, give it a couple seconds, and then we're going to talk about the definition. If it needs further explanation, or I think that there's more that we could add to it, or any clarification, I'm going to do so. All right, so here we go. Attorney General's Memorandum. Attorney General's Memorandum. This is a statement about discrimination. Everyone listing a property must receive. This is New Jersey specific. This is the State Attorney General's Memorandum. This is something that is usually just on the back of every single listing contract. So it's something that you really don't need to know too much, other than that it's attached to every listing. It's something that everyone must receive it. They don't need to sign anything. They just need to receive it. So it's usually on the back of it, kind of like a memo. Blockbusting. Blockbusting. It's inducing panic selling based on prejudice. Based on prejudice. And I usually say prejudice of it's members of a protected class moving in, or some sort of dynamic changing that has to do with protected classes. Because let's talk about panic peddling, that blockbusting that isn't necessarily blockbusting. It's just prudent sales. Is if a dumpster. So there's been a lot of like movements in certain areas where, let's say, a new landfill's moving in. Okay, there's particular towns in our state that have had that recently, where there have been landfills that are ready to be built. Oh, landfills are not a protected class. So we're not. If I go to a seller, I knock on someone's door, I say, "Hey, the landfill that's going to be built down the road. I think it might be a prudent time for you to sell, because this will only deteriorate the value of your home as in regards to market value." There is panic that I'm inducing in them, but it's not based on a prejudice. Okay, if I said that a protected class is predominantly moving in, that's different. That is blockbusting. The other one is just kind of good sales technique. You know, again, landfills, not protected classes. You know, religious organizations, demographics, anything that has to do with race, ethnicity, things like that, they are protected classes. Civil Rights Act of 1866. Civil Rights Act of 1866. This is a federal law. Protected classes are race and color. There are no exceptions to this law. Later on, I'm going to talk a little bit about a Supreme Court case in 1968, Jones versus Mayer. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this because there's a couple of examples that I could give you a little further into the video. But the key to this is there are no exceptions to this law. Other laws might have exceptions, right? Other federal laws that do offer exceptions. However, there's a second federal law, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which allows for no exceptions. No exceptions to this law. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD. The Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's a federal agency enforcing civil rights compliance. Very simple. Not much more I could really add on that one. They actually kind of summed it up nicely. Okay. Ooh, I gotta go back. Went too far. Sorry, guys. The Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. Now we can move forward. This is a federal law setting many protected classes. There are some exceptions. Yeah, there's definitely some exceptions to this. And this is the one that I kind of like to talk about. Jones versus Mayer is going to actually probably be the applicable case that I mentioned here. So let me tell you a little bit about Jones versus Mayer and the exception that we're kind of talking about. Individual homeowners, you know, are exempt from this if they're not using a broker. They do not have any kind of discriminatory advertising that they're using. So if you're doing it for sale by owner, you aren't using discriminatory advertising. and you don't own 3 or more properties, and you haven't done a sale such as this within the last 24 months, I'll just double check. Yeah, 24-month period. I was right. I was just checking my notes real quick. So you are exempt from the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. However, there was a court decision that came down. There's a case, a very infamous case, Jones versus Mayer. So let me tell you a little bit about Jones versus Mayer. Jones was looking to purchase a home. Mayer was selling. Okay, Mayer qualified for the exemption. Okay, the exception under the Fair Housing Act of '68. Qualified for the exception, and was discriminating Jones solely based on race. And this was in St. Louis, Missouri, I believe. Now, that's fine, because race is a protected class under the Fair Housing Act of '68. However, Civil Rights Act of 1866 does not allow for any exceptions, and race is covered in that. So you cannot discriminate. So based on one law, you can, but based on the second law, you can't. And also in the state of New Jersey, we do have the law against discrimination, which covers it even further on a state level. So just because something might be okay in one law, there's another law that contradicts it and basically says there are no exceptions for that. So lost the case. Boop. The law against discrimination. Again, this is New Jersey specific. It's New Jersey's law governing discrimination in real estate transactions. So this is New Jersey's law governing discrimination in real estate transactions. Law against discrimination, also referred to as the New Jersey law against discrimination, also abbreviated the NJLAD. See it any of those ways. NJLAD, law against discrimination, or the NJLAD, or New Jersey law against discrimination. I think I said that a couple times. Mount Laurel 1 and Mount Laurel 1 and 2. So these are 2 court cases that are covering moderate income housing. New Jersey specific have to do with the town of Mount Laurel. Some of you, depending on where you are in the state, might not even know what Mount Laurel is. That's down by Cherry Hill area. So these cases came about in the 80s and had to do with the NAACP suing the state of New Jersey for not having moderate income housing in certain areas. So now, basically, I'm going to give you the broad stroke of the pen. The book gives you a very broad stroke of the pen. I think they give you 3 sentences. Mount Laurel 1 and 2, basically what happened was Mount Laurel 1 was a court decision that came down that said each town has to have some moderate income housing. Every community has to allow for this. Mount Laurel 2 decision kind of elaborated on that, gave you a more in-depth, detailed outline as to what you needed to have as far as a 20% set aside for new communities, things like that. You don't really need to know the minutiae. You just simply have to know that Mount Laurel 1 and 2 decisions were court cases that had to do with moderate income housing in New Jersey. Protected class. Protected class. What is a protected class? This is a specific group that may not be discriminated against depending on what law you're looking at. So we talked about that in blockbusting. We were talking about blockbusting. We said, hey, the landfill is not a protected class. It's not a specific group that may not be discriminated against. It's a thing. It's a thing that's happening. It has an economic impact. There's concerns that might be around that where, hey, do you want to live in a community that has a landfill 2 blocks away? Hey, you bought this home 20 years ago. There wasn't a landfill. Now there is. You want to live here. There's a lot of people that are affected by economic obsolescence, external obsolescence. Route 9 in New Jersey used to be residential, used to be all residential. And now there's a spattering of residential homes. Their values have changed depending on how you look at it. They could sell to commercial developers, so there might be some sort of increase. But the appeal for someone living in a residential home on Route 9, like literally on Route 9. It's probably vastly different from where it was when they originally purchased a home in the 60s and the 70s, when there was no such thing as Route 9. So there are external impacts that a home has that changes the market value. And again, it might not be discriminatory to, key in on them and say, hey, you want to sell your home because of the landfill coming? However, if you do say, hey, do you want to sell your home because, there's a large influx of Asian Americans coming in, there's a large influx of Jewish community moving in, a lot of those things, that's inducing panic that is based on a specific group or a protected class. You can't do that. That's blockbusting. Redlining. Redlining. This is a refusal to lend in certain areas, usually inner city. I need to clarify this a little bit because the book, this is literally what the book says. Don't like the way they word it because it's lend or insure. I tell you, I take the words exactly the way that the book has it. However, the book contradicts itself. So it says refusal to lend and insure in the chapter. And then in the key terms, it says it only alludes to lending. It is lending and insuring in certain geographic areas. So they put a red line around it and say we are not lending in certain areas. Again, usually inner city. I don't like that they added that because it could be anywhere. Okay, redlining is not something that just happens in inner cities, and even saying that it only usually happens in inner cities is not really what should be part of the definition. So again, that's my 2 cents on this, but it is still a decent definition of it. I would just add lend or insure. Reverse discrimination. Reverse discrimination. This is benign discrimination intended to correct past wrongs. I don't have much more to add on that one. It is what it is. Steering. Channeling home seekers to or away from certain areas. I'm going to get into a story actually that I have about this in a little bit when we talk about testers. But again, this is channeling home seekers to a certain area based on them belonging to a certain group, certain demographic, certain religion, and or away from certain areas because of the same things. Okay. Tester. Told you I had a story for this. I do. Undercover checker who monitors fair housing compliance. So let me tell you a little bit about this story because it kind of has to do with the 2 definitions that we just went over combined. So there was an agent in New Jersey who was taking a mother and I believe a 7-year-old son out to see homes. And the town that they were looking is predominantly Jewish, predominantly Orthodox Jew, and that, not hiding the football on that one, okay? It's exactly that. It is predominantly Orthodox Jewish families, okay? And most people who are going there are aware of that. And what happened was the agent was in the home, and the little boy came to her and said, they have 2 refrigerators. Why is that? The agent answered, now the family keeps kosher. So if you don't know anything about keeping kosher, Jewish families who do keep kosher separate the meat and the dairy. So they usually have 2 refrigerators that are within fair striking distance of one another. So they'll have one usually in the kitchen and one in the dining room usually. And that's how they keep their meat and dairy separate. Okay. So the little 7-year-old boy came to the real estate agent and said, hey, why are there 2 refrigerators? This was odd to him. Okay. And like we do with most children when they ask a question, we want to answer it with, and she wanted to come off knowledgeable and pleasant to both the mother and the son. So she said, well, this is a family that keeps kosher. We're in an Orthodox community, so you're probably going to see this again, where we'll go into some homes and you'll see the 2 refrigerators, and that simply just means that they're probably keeping kosher, and they have to separate, and keeping kosher is a religious thing, and they have to keep their meats and dairy separate. You probably think that answer isn't a bad answer. It's a bad answer, and I'll tell you, there's only one thing that makes it a bad answer. What makes it a bad answer is when she said, "This is an Orthodox community." The mother and son, they were actually testers. So there was a housing and urban development complaint that came down all through that civil rights complaint, stuff like that, yada yada, blah blah blah. I won't get into the minutia of that. But for that simple, what seemed like a very good answer to a question that you would answer a kid, turned out to be something that was considered steering, because it was considered that they were actually steering them away from the community because they were not Orthodox. Okay, so that's tester steering, my little story there. Title 8. Title 8. This is a section of the Federal Rights Act that covers housing. Simple. I got nothing else. That's it. Chapter 4.